Center for World Catholicism. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel this morning on African diaspora studies, the African Catholic diaspora in particular. We have two impressive young speakers with us today. I'll introduce the first of them to you briefly and go over the ways that they may proceed. Our first speaker this morning is Professor Dominic Pasura. Comes to us from Middlesex University in the United Kingdom. He works as a research fellow in the Social Policy Research Center there. He has a PhD in sociology from Warwick. He's doing important and interesting work on the experience of Zimbabwean immigrants into the United Kingdom and the ways in which their experiences are opening doors to rethink what we think traditional immigration patterns and processes of assimilation, inculturation, and so on look like in a different context with different communities. There's a more extensive biography of him and his work. I believe he has a book, African Transnational Diasporas. What a coincidence. And please join me in welcoming Dominic. He will speak first, and then we'll turn to Daniel.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have to first thank Bill, Francis, and Karen for the invitation to come and speak here, which is quite an honor. I'm a sociologist, as you already know. I think that sort of this gives the framework in which I explore the issues of Zimbabwean Catholics or the African diaspora in Britain. The way I structured my presentation this way is much more informed by diaspora and transnationalism as theoretical frameworks. But as Robert gave an excellent presentation yesterday on this concept, so I will not try to repeat the presentation, but I will, of course, point some aspects of some direction that I think we need to explore. And then I'll go on and talk about the experience of Zimbabweans in Britain, and also how it informs about global Catholicism. But perhaps the main argument, my main argument is, and this argument is something that I've been trying to talk or ask questions about. To me, I see the tensions between what I call rootedness, the attachment to bounded forms of Catholicism, and an openness to the world. How do you hold on to both? Is it an either or not? I think before I talk about Zimbabweans, perhaps some of you don't know where Zimbabwe is. So let me just give you a little bit of picture. This is a map of Africa. Zimbabwe is in southern Africa. That in blue is a country of 13 million, colonized by Britain in 1890, and got independence in 1980. So we've got 100 years of colonial rule. And let me just then briefly go into the not theoretical debates, but just what I would think others say. We have moved, or we are passing, from the era of the nation states to the age of diasporas, border crossing and transnational diasporas. I think for me, diaspora, I don't look at it as an extension of the nation states, but in a way, the way it disrupts the nation states. in terms of the multiple frames of references that it certainly points for those who are within the diaspora. If you recall, I think when Bill gave us the introduction speech about this conference, he referred to the movement from the global south to the north. Well, I think that's a traditional or conceptualization of the pattern of migration that we know. But new patterns are emerging. And we must be attentive to these new patterns of migrations. For example, the south to south, people moving from Indonesia to Malaysia, from Zimbabwe to South Africa. But there are also another corridor from the north to south, from Portugal to Brazil, from Portugal to Mozambique and Angola. And also another corridor, north to north, from Germany to the United States, from the UK to Canada or Australia. So let us sort of broaden our way of looking at how Catholicism is spreading, not just the south to north. This is one point, obviously, that I wanted to make. Now, on diaspora, I say I will not touch into it. But I think one thing that I think we need to know about diaspora is, I think this concept has been stretched. In fact, everything has become a diaspora. White diaspora, liberal diaspora, gay diaspora, deaf diaspora, queer diaspora. But if everything is diaspora, the concept loses its analytical value. So we need to put conceptual boundaries in a way. So when we talk of, what do we mean when we talk of religious diasporas? Now, instead of suppressing the discussion or preventing the discussion that all Catholics, Methodists, Sikhs, Muslims are examples of a diaspora, we need to examine whether or not they constitute a diaspora, borrowing from debates about immigration studies about diaspora. In a way, in my book, I try to contribute to that discussion of diasporas, which I will not try to go into it. And here I'm not trying to close the debate by saying, well, they are a diaspora. Of course, if you are from a postmodernist framework, we make no reference to ethnicity, homeland, or particular place of settlement in defining diaspora. You can say, well, there is a sense in which we can talk of religious diasporas. If you are like Rogers Brubeck, I would say, I think, you know what, let us define diaspora as sort of, it's a category of practice. It is a term that is appropriated by a number of people as a stance, as an idiom. Then you may think they are religious diaspora. But I think, to me, I think we haven't really perhaps addressed it. I think it's a question that is worth of greater conceptual clarity in extending this concept to diasporas. But classical diaspora theorists, they are more hesitant. Why? Because that idea of the homeland, where is the homeland? It's very difficult to, this spiritual center. Let me say a little bit about my research methodology. My research was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which was a postdoctoral research, and I did conducted 28 interviews with informants and 3 priests. And myself, I'm a Catholic, so I think I was also more like the object and subject of my own research. But also it builds on my own multi-sided ethnography of Zimbabweans in diaspora, of which I've quite published extensively on that. Now let me just move to the Zimbabwean Catholic community in England. As I said, in a country of roughly 13 million, 2 to 3 million Zimbabweans live in the diaspora. and more than 200,000 are in Britain. I've identified what I call 5 phases from Zimbabwe into the diaspora, starting from the 1960s. But I think the major exodus started from the late 1990s due to the economic and political crisis in the country. But also people were responding to opportunities abroad. So we are not just talking of refugee diaspora, but even labor migrants. Also white Zimbabweans with dual nationality, British, and they're also moving abroad. So people use diverse routes to enter into Britain or to move into the diaspora. The Catholic community started in 2002 by community just coming together. But I will try to explore why. Why did they come together? And also we've got 2 priests that were sent by the Catholic bishops to care of the community. They don't have an ethnic parish. They are sort of embedded within the local parishes, but perhaps once a month they hold a Zimbabwean mass either in Shona or in DePaul. But I think, I think in Europe, perhaps, I assume perhaps the same is the case in the US context, that immigrants, refugees, are portrayed as the other. They are strangers. They come to take our jobs, houses, and benefits. That's the discourse. That's the discourse that is there. And I think for Zimbabweans, they came in as perhaps mostly as refugees. I think they see their experiences as Babylon and Egypt. In terms of the suffering that they have to go through, not just through the journey, but in the places of settlement, in terms of racism. When you look at the mode of incorporation, how Zimbabweans were incorporated into Britain, you could say it was sort of mediated by a hostile reception from the British government and considerable prejudice and hostility from the host society and a weak pre-existing co-ethnic community. I think these conditions fostered migrants sort of to come together and engage in these transnational religious ties. Like that sort of quotation from one respondent who said, we think we are in Babylon. This is our Babylon. And even the priest, they emphasize, this is our Babylon. This is why in Egypt. But you see what? Maybe that is only the extent to which the analogy ends, because unlike the Israelites sort of in Babylon, Zimbabweans wants to remain in Britain, so they want to remain in Babylon. But insulated from British secular values and norms. And I think because of racism, discriminations, and within the British context, Zimbabwean Catholic congregation, there are spaces for belonging, for sociality. So when people were going to the local British masses, I think people were not satisfied, as that quotation illustrates. People were not satisfied in just attending Sunday Mass. They wanted more from it, socially and spiritually, but it wasn't there. I have coined a term to try to describe what is happening with the Zimbabweans, and I think perhaps a transnational extended family captures how the migrants think the church is a home. The church is part of the family. They help each other in finding jobs, accommodations, birthday parties. So a birthday party is no longer something but private. Everyone in the church knows when you have a birthday, when you have a graduation, when there is bereavement. They spend, they always discuss people die in the diaspora, and I think like Zimbabweans, we want to better ourselves in Zimbabwe, not in Britain. So I think people go there and spend their time. So I think they really want something more from the church, but of course the church perhaps was not sort of providing it. But also these churches, there are spaces to help in the upbringing of children. I think this is a big issue. This is quite a big issue because in a way there's a bit of a conflict in how children are brought up from an African perspective and the demands in Britain, I think African Catholics, and also African, they think that the British state has taken away the power to discipline children. In a creative way, Zimbabwean Catholic, they use the church's pass that authority to the church to bring our children. I think with those sort of pictures, on our land of good counsel in Birmingham, that, as I said, it's a space for sociality. And also they formed this guild of St. Agnes and St. Aloys for youth. It's quite vibrant, and where children, they learn more about African values and norms, as well as their Catholic faith. And mind you, they don't learn more about the Queen or the British. They say, well, I think that is, they do it some other places. I think one of the points that I mentioned is that, you see, for the majority of Zimbabwean Catholics, I think they refer to what they call the spiritual dryness they experience when they go to the local British masses. Is that quotation say, you go there, it's rather flat, no much activity, finish mass out, that's the end. Comes next week, again the same thing, 30 or 40 minutes, or 45 minutes, and that's it, out. To me, I miss what I was used to, which makes prayer more meaningful and even more exciting as we go through the service. I think because of that spiritual dryness, they try to say, okay, let us congregate here. So they first congregate, and then the bishop had to send the priest, but first initially they congregate on their own and asking English priests to come and say mass to them. In a way, it mirrors the work of anthropologist who did a study on African Pentecostals in the Netherlands, who referred to what she called the valley of dry bones, to refer not only to the spiritual condition of Europe, but also to the hostile reception that they experience in the Netherlands. Zimbabweans equally share the same experience. Now, I think, let me just then perhaps pause a little bit and see this 2-minute video to show exactly what Zimbabweans what they were missing and what they recreated. In fact, I think after perhaps the 2-minute video, I could as well stop because it captures something that I want to say. the enthusiasm, the African drums, the singing, the dancing, that is at the center of African Christianity or African Catholicism. This is what they were missing, and this is what definitely I think they created. I think you would have seen sort of women wearing religious uniforms and the like. I will return to that and in much more detail. Now, I think in terms of the practices and theologies, I'm not a theologian, to be honest. In fact, I don't know why I use theologists there, but I think as a sociologist, but what you will see is the shift in sacred. Zimbabwean Catholics see Britain as a non-sacred space which need to be re-sacralized and re-evangeliized. And African Catholicism is the new frame of reference, or the new source of authenticity in terms of African practices. So they bring with them not just the religious association, the drums, the uniforms, everything. In fact, it's important for Zimbabwe. So there is a very strong religious transnational ties with the church back home. And of course, they do other things like periodical or contributions to the training of priests or learning new songs, and of course the sending of priests to cater for them. So how do they see themselves? Well, that quotation perhaps captures how they relate with perhaps the church hierarchy in Britain. We are under Westminster, which is England and Wales, but because of our special needs, which relates to diaspora communities, we still have got roots in Zimbabwe. When I talk of we, I refer to elders. We still buy properties in Zimbabwe. We still bed ourselves in Zimbabwe. Until such a time we stop going to bed ourselves there, we can say we might just ignore the Zimbabwean directives. So we remain an extension under the auspices of Westminster. I think that they see very much themselves as connected. These Zimbabwean directives are the bishops and the priests and the practices. Now I'm going to illustrate. Just give you a bit of examples to see how these connections pans out. I think well, thank you, because we changed something here. Perhaps there is nothing that I was looking for. But one of the things before I go to the hymns is about the African names. You know, I think in Zimbabwe, as in some parts of Africa, at baptism, it's sort of customary for you to be given European names, and African names were sort of regarded as sort of not good enough due to the colonial and post-colonial era. But what is happening in the diaspora is, I think through my research, is that people are now adopting African names at baptism. And one of the priests, the quotation, one of the priests said, you know what, with Father Conley, in his experience with the Zimbabweans, most of them have got Irish names, but now they are going for African names. Well, that was a quotation, I don't know how I missed it. Well, I didn't study exactly what the meaning of those names. Perhaps there's something to say about the British, you know. Because you see, names, they always have meanings. So, of course, I think that's sort of, I think that's sort of an example, you know, yeah. I wanted to give, or perhaps it's coming. Yeah, I think it's coming. So I just switched it off. Okay, maybe let me go to the example. Yeah. That is Father Conley, who is the parish priest, you know, who is Irish, by the way. When I first had to deal with the Shona people, the thing that fascinated me was that so many had Irish names, but now what I'm finding is that people are going for African names, you know? And I looked around 400 Zimbabweans sort of were baptized in this parish, you know? So that's quite interesting. As I was saying, that during Corona and post-Corona era, it was almost mandatory that you may be given European names. Perhaps that's why I'm called Dominic, maybe. And another name in between Mazolo, they sort of squashed, you know, yeah. But there is a change. In fact, even my son, I give him a new, which is Shona name again, yeah. Okay, let me just go back then to the new hymns. You know, the hymns that are sung in church, you can't just compose them here in England and Wales and learn it. I can't do that. It is not allowed, because every piece of music sung in the church must go through the Music Composers Association in Zimbabwe and be approved. If you compose a song here that's in the diaspora, you must put it on tape, recorder, and send it to Zimbabwe for approval. They are not sending it to Westminster. And also, I think the former chaplain concurs that, you see, because the structure of Zimbabwean compositions are based in Zimbabwe, what it means is that for people in the diaspora, you know, they have to submit it to the homeland for approval. But you see, one of the key practices that you have seen perhaps in the video, women wearing religious uniforms, women's guilds. In fact, women's guilds, they are the foundation of Catholicism in Africa. When you talk of Catholicism in South Africa, if you remove this fraternal church women fellowship, you have removed the core aspect, the essence of African Catholicism. In the diaspora, 6 different guilds have been formed. St. Anne, Mary Queen of Heaven, Sacred Heart of Jesus, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and Solidarity of Our Lady. I think there are 5. You ask, well, what is the 5th? The 6th one, I think I'll come into that. No, the uniforms which they put home, they are imported from Zimbabwe, and of course it shows that their commitment. I think when you look at those sort of women with the uniform, you will see the one in blue with no uniform, you know, I think that's the 6th one, but I'll again return to it. Here, I think they were part of the diocesan procession of faith in Bedford in 2012. You might watch much more closely, you know, I think this is the one, Chita Chamaria, Mary Queen of Heaven. And Chita Champuya Anna, St. A. In a way, you might think they are sisters. In fact, when they walk in British Street, someone said, "Are you a sister?" They are not. In fact, they become the visible face of Catholicism or African Catholicism in the diaspora. But you see, I just want to move a little bit in a way in which these women's guilds are constituted in the diaspora. I would say the diaspora is a contested space. I think it's not quite easy. It's not easy to sort of constitute these women guilds in the diaspora. I think this goes on to the tension that we're talking about. You know, these women's guilds, they're so important for the identity of women in their daily lives. Everywhere, they put on the uniform. It is a mark of their identity. So the issue of coexistence becomes an issue between the different guilds. I think back home, St. Anne was based in a particular diocese and another guild in a particular diocese, but in the diaspora they have to coexist. In fact, there are conflicts in terms of recruiting new members. Not just among Zimbabweans, but even those beyond the Zimbabweans. So there's a fight of who is superior, who is not. And of course, works of charity, how you upbring your children, how you take care of the family, those are the markers of whether you are a good sort of woman who belong to the guild. But I think the most marker that is problematic, which J.S. Joseph touched, is about marriage. To belong to the guild, you must be married. But you see, in Britain, I think there are all sorts of issues, like Father Zadagu, who was the former chaplain, said. There are divorced individuals, widows, single parents, but people still want to deepen their faith. And because of visa restrictions, some of the women who were primary migrants as nurses coming to Britain, they failed to bring in their husbands. And it's very difficult to prove whether they are married or not. So, marriage became quite an issue. In fact, there are new forms of marriages, which are described as moving, more like cohabitation. People are just staying together. But I think from an African perspective, that is not marriage. They're just staying. And you can't be part of the guild. You can't be cut. So there's always conversation, why that woman is wearing the uniform, because she's not married or whatever. In a way, of course, women are constructed as the guardians and the repository of African Catholicism and respectable behavior. I think that quotation from a male respondent, in fact, captures everything. You know what? He said, it's very serious, a serious problem happening within the guilds, as most of them are no longer following their guidelines. If you look at those wearing uniforms, it should be a certain length. When wearing a hat, no hair should be visible. They wear the uniforms going to local parishes where the priest is not aware of the rules. They've thrown quite a few things out through the window. They're not following what they should do. So there are those conflicts. And as I said, I think it is no coincidence that in 2010, a new guild was formed. Initially it was called Non-Aligned Ladies, but later on renamed Gracious Catholic Women. It has no uniform to mark its identity and does not insist on marriage as a precondition for membership. Well, I think for Zimbabwean Catholics, I think they regard Britain as sort of a godless people. Look at their lives, their culture, gay marriages, divorces, the collapse of the family. It's a pagan society. So, which needs to be again. So although religious spaces started as spaces for belonging, they've sort of reinvented themselves as agents of reverse mission. But how do they do it? Exemplified by wearing religious uniforms, enthusiastic singing, accompanied by drums, by being embedded in local parishes and going on pilgrimages. Now, the current sort of chaplain who is now the Bishop of Gweru, this is how we understood reverse mission. On an ordinary Sunday, a religious woman who belonged to the Guild of St. Anne, Sacred Heart, would wear a religious uniform and at the same time go and mix. So people would ask, what does this religious uniform you are wearing stand for? In that way, she will also defend your faith and explain also what it stands for. In that way, it will be like a pulpit where they are preaching what they believe in. So it's not going on and knocking people's doors, but just wearing those religious uniforms. Let me just then move to what does it mean. Obviously, the example that I've given on new hymns, African names, women's skills, and reverse kinship. Obviously, it illustrates the shift in the center of gravity from of Catholicism, of Christianity from Europe to Africa. However, it also illustrates the ways in which embracing a global transnational Catholic identity is linked to, rather than separated from, its expression in particular cultural context. I think you have seen, in the video that I've shown, that on the part of Zimbabweans, for example, the conduct of Mass, I think they prefer the African drums, the songs, the dancing. On the part of the non-migrants, they prefer the piano thing. So the dynamics are different. And this causes tensions within mixed congregations. Well, I think it's the singing and the dancing. And these tensions were noted by the parish priest, with Father Conley. What Zimbabwean Catholics brings is perceived differently by non-migrants and also by migrants themselves. They see themselves as engaging in reverse mission, but non-migrants see it differently. Father Conley explains, the reverent enthusiasm of the Shona, which is Zimbabwean, can help people in prayer, but there are other people, the only way to pray is silently. They do it, they don't want to be distracted. And I'm not being negative to you, he said, but I've been here for a bit. Someone said to me, lots of dark faces in the church, Father. I just said, yes, they are all Catholics. We are not having it. In the parish next door, this sounds bad. Two families came to the priest and said, we are not coming to the church because there are too many dark faces, and we are going to so and so because they don't have any dark faces there. So when migrants come, obviously this poses perhaps a threat to the local Catholic identity. And it also can potentially lead to this strong assertion of local practices. Those are the tensions that perhaps we need to think about. How do we sort of resolve? I've said, I think you see what, to me, I try to summarize it as it is between rootedness and openness. Perhaps try to appropriate the concept of cosmopolitan sociability in order to understand this, provided it's a framework of holding on to both rootedness and openness. As Sheila and colleagues said, if cosmopolitanism is viewed as arising from social relationships that do not negate cultural, religious, or gender differences, but see people as capable of relationship, of experiential commonalities, despite differences, then we have another lenses through which we view and theorize social relationships. Not as either or, not as binaries, but trying to hold on to both. And of course, the examples that I've given of Catholics in England illustrate how Catholics in the diaspora can simultaneously maintain bounded forms of attachment, while at the same time they remain nested within the global Catholic community. Yet, of course, we know that the dangers of affirming ethnic national labels is that this can reproduce or reinforces exclusion and inequalities. In fact, within the migration literature, there is a push to find new terms beyond this methodological nationalism of reinforcing, using ethnic lenses in understanding how people move. So by emphasizing the African Catholicism embodied in liturgical practice such as the use of African drums, singing, and dancing, as well as women's skills, Zimbabwean Catholics in Britain have maintained this simultaneous rootedness in in particular forms of belonging and religious commitments, as well as an openness to global Catholicism, exemplified in this sort of reverse mission. So in a way, I'll end by saying I think perhaps we need to see the scattered immigrant and refugee Catholic communities as a new frontier in missionary work. Okay, I'll end by showing you, I think, the last sort of video again on Zimbabwean Catholics.
Thank you, Dominic, for that interesting presentation on the levels there. There will be time for questions for both speakers after we hear from our next panelist. I'm proud to introduce my colleague, Dan McNeil. Dan is the holder of the prestigious Wells-Barnett Professorship of African and Black Diaspora Studies here at DePaul University. Previous holders of that chair include the inimitable Michael Eric Dyson, Washington, and others. Dan did his doctoral work at the University of Toronto. His most recent book is entitled Sex and Race in the Black Atlantic, Mulatto Devils and Multiracial Messiahs. So, and now for something completely different. My colleague, Dan.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. I really appreciate the chance to be here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Francis, thank you to Karen for inviting me, and thank you everyone for contributing to such a critically important discussion about Catholics and diaspora. The title of the conference, Scattered and Gathered, pays homage to the etymology of diaspora, the scattering and dispersal of people, ideas, and concepts in the ancient world. Such origins often betray a rather male and phallocentric approach. We think about the adventurers, the buccaneers, the conquistadors, who ventured out into the world in search of adventure. And so what I'd like to do is talk about a trinity of idiosyncratic figures who help us think about the movement of ideas, diaspora, during the 1950s and 60s. And what I'd argue is that period is crucial for us to think about diaspora, whether it's linked to the movements of people as it relates to a civil rights movement, but also, most importantly for myself, in terms of thinking about the incubation of diaspora as an academic discipline. I think we see that in the 1950s and 60s. And the three kind of idiosyncratic people I'd like to think about in the 1950s and 60s is starting by thinking about James Bond. As Michael said, something completely different. Someone who combines brute sexuality and sadism in his missions on behalf of a British Secret Service. And after talking very briefly about Bond and Ian Fleming, James Bond's creator, I'll turn to Philippa Schuyler. Maybe just by a show of hands, do many of you know this individual? Okay. Famous in the 1930s as a child prodigy. She gets cast and she is imagined as a black Shirley Temple, is how the newspapers of the time imagine Philippa Schuyler. And as you can see here from the Jet magazine front cover, there's a sense of what happens to someone after they've been marketed as a child prodigy. Well, for Philippa Schuyler, she thought about creating a life for herself as a Catholic writer, as someone who penned hagiographies and testimonials to the likes of Albert Schweitzer as she moved to Rome in the 1950s. But what we find, and what I'd like to talk about today, is by the 1960s, she imagines herself as a femme fatale, often by re-engaging with Ian Fleming in the Bond novels. So how does a talented, lonely individual create herself anew and imagine a new life for herself as Felipa Monteiro? So she tries to renounce her American roots and imagine herself as a Portuguese individual, whether that's as a Catholic writer early on, but later as a writer of sexy novels, as she calls them. Particularly novels that demand, in her eyes, quite racist caricatures of an African diaspora. And I'd like us to think about what it is to engage with popular culture and the morality and the responsibility of the artist. Last but not least, I'll turn to Frantz Fanon, one of the most famous intellectuals of an African diaspora, and I'll argue that he helps us think a bit deeper about shame and some of the ways in which we can fight back a bit against women and men who crave the sensation of playing a role that they have seen so many times in movies and read about so many times in novels. Okay. So this is the general framework for thinking about how do we understand the 1950s and 60s as a way of thinking about the emergence of diaspora as an academic discipline, and then thinking about, well, what are some of the legacies that we can think about in terms of moving forward and understanding shame and guilt as productive concepts as well as overwhelming ones. All right. So let's begin with Mr. Bond. I'm sure he's been expecting this. All right. So, Ian Fleming's stories about James Bond first appeared at a time of anxiety in British life. Okay, so Winston Churchill, its eloquent and imperialist leader during World War II, had just suffered a major stroke. And various foreign policy crises displayed the continuing decline of British and imperial and military power. Think about Suez crises and various other threats to the British psyche as an imperial power. The Bond series imagines a robust hero who can resuscitate British power with the help of the US and some of the English-speaking Commonwealth. a heroic representative of an Anglosphere that was most famously expressed by Winston Churchill in his Sinews of Peace address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5th, 1946. On that day, Churchill spoke of an alliance between English-speaking nations. The special relationship was often used as a euphemism for white leadership or so-called white blood, guiding non-whites into an appreciation for law and order, good government, and security in the 1950s and 60s. Infamously, Sir Hugh Trevor Roper, who at the time was Regius Professor of Oxford University, repeated Hegel and said that there is no history in Africa. There may be the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque and irrelevant parts of the globe. But for Roper, there was no history in Africa. So this is some of the context that influenced Fleming when he goes to write Bond. He's also lamenting the loss of his bachelorhood. He goes to Jamaica and he wants to imagine these particular worlds. But it's also thinking about the loss of British power and some of these crude racist stereotypes. So drawing on his experiences, Fleming's novels convey a concern about the ability of Africans to govern themselves. Black Jamaicans are depicted as kind and lazy, with the virtues and vices of a child in Dr. No. In Quantum of Solace, Bond describes black Nigerians as having simple, kindly natures and knowing nothing about birth control. In the novel of Live and Let Die, this is the film version in 1971, the black genius who threatens Bond has a so-called healthy dose of white blood. With that said, the Bond books did not simply assume that all non-white individuals were childish or evil. Although they were informed by racist ideologies that allowed Bond to dispatch individuals that were perceived as ugly, they also involved stories in which Bond was willing to work with non-white individuals who seemed beautiful or friendly to European men. Bond would, for example, protect the individual here called Solitaire, who's labeled in the books to be of distant African blood, maybe a quarter black in the problematic pseudo-scientific language of the time. And this is really important for Skylar, who's grown up in an American context where she's surrounded also by images of black rapists. Here we have a 1920s film, Regeneration, that depicts very similar attitudes about black bestiality. And what I think we find with Philippa Schuyler, here we can see why she was marketed so much as the Black Shirley Temple. There's this sense of how she is a precursor of many of the formal quests of contemporary multiracial individuals. She's a well-known concert pianist. The New York labels Philippa Schuyler Day in March of 1941 during New York's World Fair. She's obviously made known as a child prodigy, but she becomes a well-known concert pianist as well. Her mother on your right, Josephine Codgel Schuyler, is a wealthy woman from a Texas background. Her father, George Schuyler, is one of the most prominent African-American journalists of the early 20th century. And the hope is that Philippa will confound Nazism, right? So there's this idea that her birth, her brilliance, will reject any of the pseudo-scientific beliefs of fascists and also right-wing anthropologists. So there's great emphasis on Philippa's IQ of 180. And yet, most journalists tend to depict the family as America's strangest family. They find it difficult to understand why a blonde Texan would fall for what they call a coal-black Negro. and the public displays of their daughter are often filed under strange curiosity. And all of this influences Philippa's desperate quest to establish an independent identity for herself, and why she often turned away from the United States. Here's one of her diary entries from 1960. What are some of the consequences of this? She demands that her father remove her entry in his book of the greatest African Americans. So one of the greatest heartaches for historians is to go and see the draft of George Schuyler's book, and the entry that he lovingly created for his daughter is covered up with a white piece of paper. But we also get a sense of, if Philippa Schuyler denies the United States, if Philippa Schuyler denies her particular identity there, how does she create a new identity? She wants to become Philippa Montero. What does that mean, and what materials does she draw on? So, what does she do initially? She goes to Rome. She goes to Rome in hopes of becoming a Catholic writer. We find someone who invents an identity for herself as Philippa Montero y Schuyler. She feels that the Spanish are a little bit too proud and arrogant. She wants to be Portuguese. This is one of her great goals in life. She believes that the Portuguese will grant respect for mixed race individuals. And we see a lot of these ideas, and there's a great hope that she'll be a Catholic writer. She files a lot of reports for the John Birch Society, and you can see the fake picture that she files in these. So she literally often wants to imagine herself or portray herself racialized as white. However, after writing some reports on Albert Schweitzer, a lot of the letters that Schuyler writes to her mother between 1962 and 1963 reveal an artist who's frustrated that she doesn't get an audience with the Pope while she's in Rome. She tires of thought books that no one wanted to read, and she argues that while she's in Southern Europe, the only thing people care about is sex. They don't care about religion, they care about sex. And what she wants to do is just write novels that cater to a world in which James Bond is king. And here's one of the most prominent extracts from her letters, when she starts to say, well, I'm no longer going to be a Catholic writer, I want to imagine myself as Philippa Montero, femme fatale. To make it in this bad, bad, selfish world, you have to offer femininity, money, powerful connections. I don't have either two or three. So the question becomes, what does she do to try and imagine herself as a femme fatale? How does she try to deploy her sensitivity? And what we often see is she turned to 1960s movie culture. An avid consumer of movies, Schuyler was particularly influenced by the success of Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, the David Lean epic that won Best Oscar, the 35th Academy Awards, and explored the double consciousness of an Englishman and an Arab. She also admired The Leopard, the sensual beauty of that particular film. A novel about Don Fabrizio Corbera, Princess Selina and the Changes in Sicilian Life, which was posthumously published in 1958 and was adapted into a film in 1963. But again and again, above all of this, she just loves James Bond. She wants to see James Bond again and again and again, particularly the films that imagine Bond with a mid-Atlantic accent. So do think about how Fleming wanted someone like David Niven to play James Bond. He didn't want the virile Sean Connery to play him. And yet that's what is very successful in emphasizing Bond for an Atlantic and international audience. But more importantly, in the case of Schuyler, it's a case of powerful white men who, she argues, went into unknown lands, the way that she wanted to go into Southern Africa and Southeast Asia, and obtain the admiration of what she considered to be primitive peoples. Here are some of the forms of racism that influence Schuyler as a writer for the John Birch Society, but also her writings as a femme fatale when she adapts and appropriates James Bond. And I'll just focus on Schuyler's life and experiences in Katanga, because she happens to be there when the region sues for independence, and Patrice Lumumba, the country's first democratically elected leader, is assassinated. At that time, Schuyler created and wanted to create a Bondian hero for Southern Africa. And she really believes that she created her best work in that particular time period. And what we find in a lot of these novels are this notion of sweet brutality and semi-rape, where women rejoice in being, obtaining the love of white conquistadors. And in portraying a female protagonist who enjoyed BDSM outside of marriage, Schuyler could join a community of readers who read, particularly female fans, who tried to find progressive readings within Bond as independent women, particularly in opposition to mainstream novels and films in which an unmarried woman was considered a failure. So we see with Schuyler, she's not just engaging with Bond, she's engaging with Pearl Buck, Simone de Beauvoir, and various other figures at that time. And yet Schuyler could not completely ignore the shaming practices of her male friends. From the sensitive British intellectual who was unwilling to carry contraceptives in his car so that he could have sex in public, to the married Dutchman who disapproved of their interest in sex outside of marriage. Schuyler often creates figures such as Susan, who express shame and guilt about extramarital sex, the possibility of illegitimate children, and feeling shame about the idea of being a creative artist on their own. Ultimately, Schuyler, rather than imagining herself as an independent creative artist, draws up this rather remarkable checklist for what she hopes to achieve and obtain in terms of a husband. She doesn't want an American husband, but she does want a white European in an imperial or post-colonial setting. So he should be white, he must be European, he must be able to confer on her a nationality that she likes. He should preferably be religious, practicing Catholic, and most importantly express this virile male force. Now, she settles on a guy named Maurice Raymond, who is from France, and he fulfills her romantic fantasy because she believes that he combines Northern European intellectuality with Southern European male force vital. So again, you can see how these pseudo-scientific ideas of race and culture permeate a lot of her ideas. And she also hopes that Raymond, because he comes from a working class background, offers her dynamism as well as the staid kind of aristocratic demeanor that was so popular in many British texts of the time. And I just want to flag this particular letter because we see some of the ironies. The irony of a woman who was meant to challenge Nazism by the fact of her birth ends up idolizing someone who looks like a Nazi or looks Aryan in her eyes. Ultimately, although Schuyler does not cement her bonds with Maurice Raymond, she does have an affair with a French delegate to what was then the European Economic Commission, a guy named George Apedo, and The irony there is that although George Apedo represented French civilization, he was African. And as a result of the sexual relationship, Schuyler traveled the world searching for someone to perform a late-term abortion, because although she could tolerate his nationality, i.e. His culture as French, she could not tolerate the idea that her baby may be black. And here again we see this sense of personal identity confusions and difficulties, and how Schuyler turns to novels to try and find a way to address this. So here, this quote here, "Why bring more Negroes into the world?" is an allusion to Nella Larson's Quicksand. So where Schuyler says, "Why bring more Negroes into the world?" Nella Larson says, "Why add more suffering to the world? Why add more unwanted, tortured Negroes to America? Why do Negroes have children? Surely it must be sinful. Think of the awfulness of being responsible for the giving of life to creatures doomed to endure such wounds to the flesh, such wounds to the spirit, as Negroes have to endure." So again, we're seeing some of the consequences of anti-black racism and the notion of shame and stigmata being applied to Africa and African diaspora. And how does Schuyler deal with it? Engaging with literary texts and not always distinguishing between fiction and reality. And ultimately, this is why I turn back again to Frantz Fanon. So I'd just like to conclude by thinking again about the importance of Fanon and why his words may not be anachronistic, why they don't just help us think about the 1950s and 60s, but why they may be helpful for us in a contemporary period to think about shame and guilt. So a French wartime hero, a Martinican exile, and an Algerian freedom fighter, Frantz Fanon provides a telling counterpoint to the existential questions posed by Philippa Schuyler's life in the 1950s and 60s. His primary concern was creating a healthier future, in which artists would not assume that the essence of blackness could be found in the drums and the primitive dancing of the Congolese jungle. Typically striking pieces of Fanon's writing, including his wry critique of adventurers and heroism that happened to feature white males venturing into the heart of Africa. His notes that the children of white men and black women were often considered to be made in the bushes in Martinique. His condemnation of mixed-race women for creating protagonists who ask nothing, demand nothing, except a bit of whiteness in their lives. And his support for women in Algeria who could dress up as Western women without the sensation of performing a role that they've read in novels or a role that they've seen in film. And so while Schuyler longed to help the Vietnamese bar girls and the children of their relationships by asserting the honor of a Western identity, Fanon identified with the Indo-Chinese who went into battle against European colonizers that they blamed for the explosion of cut-price boys and girls, and shamed the United States as a monster in which the taints, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe had grown to appalling lengths. In work that combined poetry, psychiatry, and political analysis, Fanon contended that shame should be applied to the monstrous racism of Europe and North America. In doing so, he did not talk just about the guilt of those who collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. He also resisted the ideology that encouraged Europeans to absolve Nazism when it was applied to barbarism inflicted against Asian and African peoples in the name of civilization and empire. And this, perhaps, is the legacy that continues to haunt us in our reflections on Catholicism, diaspora, and post-coloniality. Fanon may, for example, be consigned to the dustbin of history. One thinks of President Barack Obama arguing that Fanon is someone who simply is available to people who fling newspapers on the fringes of college towns. Other people consider Fanon a dung heap of Freudian analysis. And we certainly see that Fanon's anti-colonial thinking has not permeated a lot of our discussions of shame and guilt in contemporary psychology. So most discussions of shame build on Helen Block Lewis, who argues that shame is directly against the self, which is the focus of evaluation, whereas guilt is negatively evaluated in connection with something, but is not itself the focus of experience. For many clinicians and researchers, shame is dangerous, painful, ugly, out of control, and less rational than guilt. Shame is equated to blood ties, honor killings, and antiquated notions that threaten social bonds. Guilt is privileged as a modern, legalistic concept that secures social bonds and solidarity, i.e. we have guilty individuals who stand trial. To go further, the focus on turning out healthy modern individuals means that social psychologists can define pride as a reasonable emotion, while considering shame to be entirely unreasonable. It's a very important strand in contemporary psychology. And even though Fanon seems repressed, ignored in those particular discussions in contemporary psychology, he does remain the leading figure in post-colonial studies and diaspora studies, particularly from the 1960s. In contrast to the rather functionalist tendencies of contemporary psychologists, post-colonial theorists and scholars of diaspora have deployed the concept of shame in order to talk about bringing a critical, dreadful objectivity to bird's-eye celebrations of national and imperial pride. I.e., it's never about quick fixes, it's never about trying to avoid hurting people's feelings. So, I don't know, Obama celebrating Margaret Thatcher as a defender of freedom, even though she also talked about Mandela as a dangerous terrorist. It's for post-colonial theories, it's always about the importance of shame as a destructive force that also allows us to move forward. Whether that's intellectuals inspired by Fanon, such as Paul Gilroy, one of the most leading intellectuals in Britain at the moment, David Goldberg, head of the Critical Studies Institute in Irvine, California, Lewis Gordon, who's currently Nelson Mandela Professor in South Africa. Shame may be considered a more productive emotion than guilt. They thus offer a critical rejoinder to liberal and conservative writers who seek to portray Fanon as an anachronistic voice who threatens proud descriptions of an imperial past. They challenge members of an infotainment sector who try to leave their guilty, nostalgic, and xenophobic dreams in private so that they can present themselves as honest, reasonable, and respectable in public. Last but not least, they invoke a living Fanon, who asks brutally honest questions about the shameful histories that continue to influence social inequalities. Gilroy and others have challenged forms of corporate multiculturalism that celebrate mixed-race individuals and others in order to display their commitment to purportedly non-racial, multiracial, or post-racial forms of business. So maybe I'd just like to conclude by thinking about a couple of newspaper articles that I recently saw. So you see, are we going to have a black James Bond? So people talk about, Idris Elba possibly taking that role. And then just today, the question is, will Chiwetel Ejiofor, so wonderful in 12 Years a Slave, linked to a Nigerian diaspora, will he play the next Bond villain? And so what we see is that in a post-Cold War context, even someone like Samuel Huntington doesn't know whether Africa is its own civilization or part of a Western civilization. And he's always talking about whether a half Arab or half French individual can be integrated into a Western civilization, We clearly see that as part of a Cold War, part of an end to the Cold War context, when people are reconfiguring what it is to understand, what it is to be Western. And we see that James Bond will continue to enjoy the company of beautiful non-white colleagues on our screens. We'll also continue to hear rumblings of a post-racial future that incorporates more and more non-white figures into a privileged caste in order to add multicultural gloss to imperial projects against non-Western civilizations. In such a context, Fanon reminds us that the shame of a specific and limited sort can be used to motivate the pursuit of valuable ideals, particularly against colonialism and neo-colonialism. Just as Philippa Schuyler reminds us about the perils and possibilities for artists who sought to escape what they considered the shame of blackness, by emphasizing the fidelity to European diasporas, white skin tones, and Western honor. Fanon reminds us that such notions of Western honor, such notions of Western civilization, can no longer exclusively be aligned with European diasporas and a white skin tone. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. We have time for a few questions. I would ask you to direct your question by way of the microphone in the back. I would also ask you please to limit yourself to a specific question to our speakers today. Time is short, so please resist the temptation to extemporize. Floor is open. Well, I've got a question. Well, as people are gathering their thoughts. Dominic, I have a question that actually touches on James Bond, albeit indirectly. I was wondering if you could speak to whether there is a presence of a political opposition in the Zimbabwean diaspora in the United Kingdom. If there is a identifiable cadre of people who are in opposition to the Mugabe regime, and if so, how that affects the experience of diaspora communities in a place like the United Kingdom. Do they find themselves the subject of interest and scrutiny by political or state intelligence agencies? And how does that perhaps affect the dynamics of interaction among people?
Well, yes, there is the opposition, the movement for democratic change in the diaspora, and essentially is quite active. I think very active, and they see themselves as sort of not just internationalizing the Zimbabwean crisis, but also as a way to fundraise for the opposition. But what has happened, I think, from 2009, when there was this unity government in Zimbabwe, we find initiative in which people want to depoliticize the diaspora. And religious congregations are one such platform. So when people go to churches, whether Catholics or Methodists or Pentecostals, I think it's a way to bridge pre-migration, ethnic divides, gender divides, or political divides. It becomes much more like a family. But of course, there are other platforms that people use to express their political opinions about what's happening in Zimbabwe and the opposition that they have. And bear in mind that I think to be granted a refugee, you must demonstrate that you belong to an opposition. So most of the congregants, definitely I think they have a political opinion or decisions to really make. In fact, some of them, they are made MDC opposition supporters. But religious spaces are much more spaces to depoliticize, on a platform to be much more inclusive.
Questions?
Thank you both for your presentations. Insightful and active questions for both of you. First, Dr. Pasura, I'm just wondering, I think on one of your early slides you described Zimbabwean Catholics as understanding or conceiving of Britain as being a non-sacred space. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit more about that and potential problems or implications for that kind of idea. And Dr. McNeil, the question is about in the, I guess, the letters that you researched for Charlotte, in your discussion you said that her ideas about an ideal husband would possibly be Catholic, and I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about her views of Catholicism.
Well, I think for Zimbabweans, they point to, as I said, I think in the presentation, to the extent in which the British public, they popularized going to the pubs, and the churches themselves are being much more vacated. But essentially, I think, the gay marriages, or the collapse of the family, and also I think realizing that I think Britain itself was the center of mission, and that it has lost its. When they come to Britain, they thought that perhaps it's much more of a separate space, but no, it is not. In fact, you will see from the way how they interact even with the bishops, in Westminster. It's like, okay, we are under the Westminster, but I think our real bishops are being home. In fact, even the uniforms, is sort of blessed or from Zimbabwe, and the bishop of the right in Zimbabwe to take away those religious uniforms people are wearing. It's not the bishop in Britain, So in a way, as I was saying, I think for them the center or the source of authentic African Catholic practices, they are not in Britain, but they are somewhere else, and they are guided by that frame of reference. So that's that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Is that better?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. She sees Catholicism a little bit in how she saw a lot of things in terms of its geopolitical usefulness. When she's asked in 1958 by Ebony magazine what would be her ideal person, she's asked why doesn't she marry by Ebony magazine. And the description she gives of a temperate, humane writer, scientist, anthropologist, missionary is very much based on her love for Albert Schweitzer and her idealization of Catholicism as a missionary force is evident. So I'd say, to bring it to a UK context, Ted Heath, the British Prime Minister, talks about the unacceptable face of capitalism in the 1970s. And I would say that Schuyler believes that Catholicism offers an acceptable face of imperialism. That would be pretty key for her understanding of the idea, and it's a way for her to understand and obtain an identity for herself outside of the United States and as part of a global community. She dies trying to help Vietnamese orphans while working with Catholic missionaries. So the helicopter perishes during the Vietnam War. So it's a way for her to challenge American isolationism, to look towards a global world, but also reinforce some of her retrograde ideas about backward indigenous peoples. So it's very much tied to a missionary ethos.
I believe we may be out of time. I encourage you to continue conversations with our speakers on your own. I dare say, if you want to explore matters of shame and guilt, there's no better place to come than the gathering of scholars on Catholicism. So you're in the right place. Thank you to both our speakers. Thank you to both of you. And